contest of wills and power. Resist the assault. A veil of safety and security. It was never.
Hello and welcome exiles to day number 7, the final day of the 7 div challenge. What did we do today? We did a tri-attribute stacker. The idea for a tri-attribute stacker is pretty simple. We have a tree where we path basically all around the planet to get decent split personalities, usually with either dex, int, strength dex, or something along those lines, getting both types of attributes. And then we get a lot of attribute scaling through Inquisitor. We get a bunch of crit from Inquisitor. We get a bunch of percent damage from Iron Will. We get a bunch of percent damage from the percent damage per 5 lowest attribute. We get a bunch of percent damage from Cyclopean Coil. Between these three sources, we're looking at a character that's getting about 600% damage from just that. That's generally a good baseline to start making a character that's going to be viable. Not only that, but we get crit cap pretty easily when we have 1000% crit chance from our intelligence and strength Inquisitor node alone. We combine that then with a Voltaxic Rift. This is a different try I've had, which is cast on crit. Cast on crit works really easily with a tri-attribute stacker because we get accuracy capped for free with Shaper's Touch. I haven't invested in accuracy at all on my character, and I have roughly, let's see if I go to attack skill, I have roughly 6,000 accuracy. Usually you only need about 4k to get accuracy cap. We have 6,000. That's just something you get pretty freely, so cast on crit is pretty easily tagged into a character like this because we also decently have some scaling on our blast rain. Our blast rain will actually kill monsters because we do have scaling for it, because percent damage is pretty generic and it'll apply to attacks and spells. Iron Will won't apply, but the other scaling in our build will. Now, what was the other concept of this character? Well, I was planning to basically blast rain, cast on crit, and then occasionally I would weave in a cast for galvanic field. Now, unfortunately, I've had a little bit of struggle with actually weaving this in, because sometimes if I held down the key and then I went to and I pressed the galvanic field at the wrong time, I don't feel like it was casting a lot of times. I was forgetting about it. It would deal a decent amount of damage because I could get up to a 90% shock on Uber Shaper, which 90% shock on this skill is something like 200 something percent more damage based on its current damage, which is like its base damage says 500k DPS. Well, it's going to deal a lot more than that once you factor in the fact you have a 90% shock, you have Wither up to about 90% increased damage taken, you have the ability to do Despair for minus 30 res. That takes you down to about 0 res for most bosses. So we should be doing a decent amount of extra damage with Galvanic Field. Unfortunately, I forgot to use it a lot, but the point is, it was cast on crit with Galvanic Field, mixing that in for basically 2 6-links worth of damage. I think Galvanic Field is a great supporting skill. It's just a matter if I can actually remember to cast it and weave it in to the build. Outside of that, we also opted to go Iron Reflexes because you get a lot of evasion from your intelligence. From Shaper's Touch Glove, we're trying to utilize all these extra bonuses we get, and we get about 200% evasion from these gloves alone, which means if we do Grace Determination, we're looking at a character that has 66,000 armor. That's pretty good for a character that doesn't really have any armor or any real good stats on their gear in terms of armor and evasion. That's literally just coming from our level 21 Grace and our level 20 Determination and the evasion scaling from Shaper's Touch. Now, I will say this build is me optimizing for Ubers. I'm optimizing to fight bosses. Armor does good in bosses. Molten Shell is really good in bosses. What isn't good in bosses is evasion for Ubers, because the Ubers have a lot of hit scan to be evaded, and evasion just falls off. Ultimately, if I was making this character, and this is what I'd recommend, because I think this character is actually really good and I want to recommend it to people, the biggest problem with this character right now is it's kind of slow, right? It's kind of slow. I optimize for doing bosses. The main thing I would change, just going to throw this out here, I would drop Iron Reflexes. I would get an invocation for Wind Dancer or an invocation for Ghost Dance. I would go with just having Grace. I would drop a Determination. I would grab a Haste. I would grab an Onslaught on Kill on one of these nodes, which I don't have right now. I have just a bunch of Dex and a bunch of Life. Onslaught on Kill wouldn't be really useful on Ubers, but while mapping, you mix in Haste, you mix in Onslaught, then you take your glove, your boot slot, and you go for, maybe you go for the 50% CDR breakpoint for cast on crit, which would be pretty easy to hit with just a crit mastery for the +3 levels on Awaken cast on crit, and you add in about 15% CDR here, and maybe you go for Temporal Rift, or you go for elevated CDR +1 Abyssal Jewel with CDR on it, and all of a sudden you're hitting that 52% CDR breakpoint, and you have a character that is elusive, plus CDR, plus actually Ashling, like Veiled Movement Speed. You start to actually get a character that can actually move around pretty quickly. I've optimized this clearly for bossing, clearly for really tight budget, but you add in a few extra divines on this build, and you could bump this movement speed up by at least 100% type of thing, and then it feels quite good to go around mapping, and it's not going to be so slow on attack speed anymore because we have no attack speed scaling in this build whatsoever, right? We've just gone for these attributes. You mix in a haste, stuff like that, it's going to have a lot more feels good, but because I was optimizing for bosses, those are the choices I made. I mean, it makes us very tanky, but ultimately you can be plenty tanky without it. Also for defenses, this character, we ramped up our max fire res just to sustain righteous fire, as well as there was a cheap Eyes of the Great Wolf with cold damage taken as fire. This is just one of the cheap 28% attribute ones. Ultimately, as far as tri-attribute stackers go, I would rank you, start out with Astromentus. Astromentus will get you, well, we could test it right now. I probably should have an Astromentus in my stash. I do have one. It's a low roll, but if I were to change out this for Astromentus, I'm going to lose a lot of dex because I have anointed a dex node, so we're going to lose a lot more dex than we would everything else. But you see here, we lose a little bit of strength, a little bit of int, and the only difference in the dex right now is just because we're losing the utmost swiftness. So ultimately, you can use an Astromentus just fine as your starter amulet, and you'll have basically the same attributes. Eyes of the Great Wolf is a bit of an upgrade, especially if you can get 32% attributes and another stat. Ultimately, if you're going to min-max this build, you want to start going for Jorgen amulets, and I'll give you an example of a Jorgen amulet. This is one I crafted. Basically, whenever I do Betrayal, I like to throw Jorgen in research, and what I would recommend doing is get a Fracture with like Fractured Crit Multi, Fractured Int, Fractured Strength, Fractured All Attributes. A Fracture like that, throw an Essence that's giving you another attribute or Crit Multi or something until you hit an OK amulet, and then throw it in tier 3 Jorgens. It's about a 1 in 7 chance to hit percent attributes, but point is, this is the optimal amulet you want to go for if you're going for a tri-attribute stacker. Something like this will end up doing a lot more for you in terms of attributes. Now granted, we're losing the dex again, but you can see this will end up being something that will scale attributes harder, especially if you're min-maxing for int specifically, or min-maxing for strength specifically, or you're doing a strength int, energy blade inquisitor, stuff like that. Point is, that's my tier of amulets. It starts out with Astromentus, super cheap, and then it gets a lot, well, not necessarily a lot more expensive, but a bit more expensive. This amulet costs about a divine, and then if you go for a really good Eyes of the Great Wolf, probably going to cost you 5, 10, 15, and then on better than that would be a really nice 3-rat talisman. In my opinion, that's how I would rank amulet choices in terms of what you should go for. All right, now besides all that, the tri-attribute stacker also gets pretty much the spellcraft just from Magebane. With 1,000 dexterity, we're getting around I want to say close to 70% spell suppress, and then we just have these nodes we're having to travel through anyways to go over here, and then 1 spell suppress roll on our gear, and we are basically spell suppress cap. We could also get spell suppress cap without spell suppress on our boots if we got spell suppress from just a Watcher's Eye spell suppress grace mod. Right now we have 98 spell suppress. This is 12%. This is 12%. If it's T1, we would be capped. If we had a bit more dex, we'd be capped. Point is, you get the idea. We get pretty much spell suppress cap right here without having it on our gear, which is really nice for defenses. Not only that, we get a lot of HP scaling from our attributes. Another benefit from my scaling our attributes is we get around 200 flat life from here. We get about 250 flat life from here. We get a decent amount of flat life from just our strength alone, about 500 flat life there. That's why we're able to have 6k life without a lot of HP investment on our tree. This is a tree that only has about, I think, around 100% increased maximum life. I'm not sure exactly, that might be roughly about where it's at. Point is, that'd normally be a pretty low number for percent life. You could expect to get a 4k to 5k life build. We have 6k life, and that's just because we have so much flat life from our attributes. What else do we get from attributes? We get other things like accuracy, evasion rating, energy shield. Without our int scaling for our energy shield, we would actually have quite a bit less energy shield. If I just showcase it real quick here, I'll spec solipsism. Our ES goes down to 500. So obviously, int's giving us quite a bit of extra ES, so that way we can go for Eldritch Battery plus Mind Over Matter, and we have a nice little extra each EHP pool blocking or defending us there as well. So hopefully that gives you like a good picture of how much we're getting out of these attributes. The main thing this character lacks in terms of what are we not getting from attributes is simply just attack speed. That's really, or just speed in general. That's really what we're missing out on. Hence, I'd recommend looking at a haste, looking at boots that give you more speed than this, but that's just kind of a little bit more gear investment. That's kind of making a build that's going to be a little bit less good at Ubers, stuff like that. And I think you'd be having a good time. This is an archetype of build that I just keep coming back to, and I enjoy it every single time I make it. And so I'm glad I tried out this setup, which is cast on crit with a bow. In the future, I'll probably try out a lot more setups with Tri-Attribute Stacker. I think I might eventually want to try something with Juggernaut, potentially. We'll see. I'll keep working at it and seeing if I can find things I really like for it. Let's go ahead and do a Minotaur map, just to give you a showcase of what this looks like while mapping. Again, I can't stress this enough. We are a pretty slow-moving walking build. Like, all we have is Flame Dash and our Blast Rain. The thing we need is movement speed. We would get movement speed by swapping out of Determination, swapping out of Armor Scaling, and just being okay with Wind Dancer plus some really high evasion and spell suppress. That is generally, in my opinion, quite good for everything content-wise. You don't really need to get Fizz Reduction until you start trying to do Ubers, in terms of like a Molten Shell for an extra shield. But that's just an easy respec if you want to do Ubers with this character. This character we ended up doing 4 out of 7. This is something that's been I've been getting worse and worse as the 7-day challenge has gone on, because this is taking me longer than I would normally want to stream. I've been streaming till about 5 a.m. in the morning because it's been taking me a while to put these characters together and do Ubers in one play session. Basically, by the time I'm doing Ubers, it's already 3:30, 4 a.m. and I am tired and I'm out of it. I massively threw in terms of play style on both Maven and Uber Eater. Those are fights on this character I never should lose, in my opinion. I think I have plenty of damage, plenty of scaling to do those fights. I was just really tired and made a lot of stupid mistakes in those fights. So I was kind of upset with myself last night for that specifically, because it just is like, I was just like, man, I never should lose that. And I still managed to, but it's something where I'm still glad I've done this challenge, because it got me to play a lot of different things and hopefully give some people some ideas how they can make some off-meta builds still capable of Ubers with not that much investment. Hopefully it gives you guys something to think about, something to do in terms of, like, I don't know, that sort of scaling and stuff. And anyways, basically this is how our playstyle is. We do that, we proc our Gauntlet Field, or Galvanic Field, and then finish him off. It was a little bit closer than I wanted it to be, but it was fine. We do have him with speed and I guess enfeeble, but not super dangerous outside of that. We probably just took a decent amount of the dig attack, and our over sustain isn't crazy. I think one of the things I would want to get in this build is some form of leech. The easiest form of leech I could get would be a alt quality void manipulation on like Galvanic Field, or ultra quality void manipulation instead of like Awakened Added Lightning on my bow here. The problem with that is when I was looking for it, I think I saw it for 3 or 4 divines. I was like, yep, can't fit that in the 10 divine budget. But that'd be another thing where it'd be like, oh, that'd be a nice boost sustain wise, because we'd have overleech in the character with the ability to overleech while fighting through content, because that's what you get with Petrified Blood. That's one of the benefits that I'm not even able to use currently because of I couldn't find a way to get in the leech easily outside of that alt quality, and the alt quality was just a little bit out of that budget range. So anyways, this is the Tri-Attribute Stacker. I want to give a brief recap out of all the builds I witnessed, all the builds I saw, and get you guys my opinion on the best characters or my takeaways from this event itself. Okay, so I'm going to go through these builds of the builds I watched from Route 2 and my own builds, and I actually didn't see Tripolar Bear's BFBB, so I can't speak for that. It looks like he went 8 out of 8, so probably a decent build, but I didn't actually see him do that, so I can't speak to that. All right. Anyways, Pathfinder Doom Cadigans. This is basically another way to scale Impending Doom, which is to use Battle Mage. There's not a lot of easy ways to get flat damage on Impending Doom. This is one of the ways you can do that. Cadigans, Battle Mage, plus a heavy flat damage, like a really well-crafted dagger with Chaos and Flat Fizz and like Dot Moldy and stuff like that. That's probably your end game. He was shopping on a budget, so he did Echo Forge. Echo Forge has a lot of flat Chaos. He was shopping on a budget. That's what he made work. But ultimately, I think he would say that isn't the S-tier min-max version. That's just the cheap, I need something with flat damage. Boom. This has a lot of flat Chaos. All right. Outside of that, I did a for Forbidden Raid Guardian. This build had a lot of problems. I didn't really think it through very much. I didn't really plan well on it. I would not recommend it. It dealt very little damage. I can't speak highly enough about how this was probably my worst build of all the builds I made. And I made a character with Heavy Strike, so that should say something. Don't play this character. 500% attack speed, Ballista, Tripolar Bear. I only saw one of these fights, but whenever you're building around the Soul Eater stack ones per second, it's just like you're going to be ramping for 50 seconds. If it takes you 50 seconds to get through a phase, your build's already going to be having a rough time, and I don't particularly recommend it. I think it's something you can maybe use as a crutch to fix a really low budget character, but I don't know if it'll feel good. So I have my doubts about this one. He went 2 for 8, so I wouldn't necessarily probably recommend that. Champ Ancestral War Chief, melee totems, just don't do it. Just don't do it. Trickster Lightning Trap, this is a good character. Lightning Trap's not necessarily the best tier of trap skill. I only ended up doing Lightning Trap because I saw a good chest with +2 proj for the base I was using. I was like, yeah, I'll throw that on. Probably a better trap skill will end up doing better than this build, even with a worse chest or a chest that doesn't have a +2 for it, and that'll be just fine. But ultimately, I went with Lightning Trap just to try it out. It was a solid build. I like Trickster for traps. It works really well. Can recommend. Wave of Conviction, Ignite Elementalist. He didn't do great with this for Ubers. I think this is more of a build that you'll enjoy mapping because it's Ignite Elementalist. It's got good clear. For bossing, he still was able to take down Shaper and Out-Eater. So even if it's a build that does decent level mapping, it did okay on bosses. Probably decent on a league start, but I don't know if I can recommend it because ultimately, I mean, he didn't kill a lot of bosses, so he had a rough time, and Rutu's generally a pretty good player. So if you're going to be not very good at mechanics, then you're probably going to get punished even harder than he was. Champion Heavy Strike. Moral of the story for this one is don't do Heavy Strike. You take the setup for this character. You don't spec for maces. You spec for a claw or a sword. You go Lightning Strike. You go a good skill. And all of a sudden, this build probably clears pretty much everything. It was very, very tanky. Had extremely good defenses along with the baseline of enemies having -60 res. It's very, very strong a way to build characters in my opinion, and I definitely can recommend it. I think it's very, very... I think the base layers of that character are very strong. It's just a matter of... I wanted to do Heavy Strike with it and see if I could get Heavy Strike to kill things, and Heavy Strike requires you to be straight up on top of the boss, and most of the Ubers have degen grounds, aka Cirrus, Maven, and Exarch, and Uber Elder. These all have degen grounds, and I almost killed Exarch, and I almost killed Uber Elder, but point is, when I have to be on top of the boss to fight the boss, I'm dying to degen grounds, and so that's the moral of the story there. I get a skill that doesn't die to degen grounds. I could even do a bow. No, I couldn't do a bow, because I need the shield. But point is, you get a more ranged ability, like Lightning Strike, like Smite, something like that, and all of a sudden, you probably do these fights much easier, and I think that's a character, basically the building blocks I can recommend. Exsanguinate Pathfinder, I think this is probably, of the builds I saw by Rutu, I think this is my favorite. I think this is the most well-rounded. It was a fast mapper. It has poison, basically proliferate plus exsanguinate chain. You're hitting everything on screen, things dying. You have Pathfinder speed with flasks, very nice defensive layers, and it had good single target. All-arounder, if I was going to pick my top build of all the builds me and Rutu made, I'd probably pick this one. It seemed, in my opinion, it seemed like the best well-rounder, fun to play, good at mapping, and good at bossing. Like, it was the whole package, in my opinion. Pyroclast Miner, or Pyroclast Saboteur Miner, this character by me, I would put this as more of a strictly bosser. It was okay at mapping, but it was a little bit on the slow side. So I would put this more as a bosser specific / middle of the road mapping. Kind of Pyroclast, if you like it, it could be fun for you. If you're better at Pyroclast and you know detonation sequencing better, you probably could make this build even stronger than I did. It was a strong character. Ultimately, it just lacks a little bit on clear. Blade Trap Sabo. This is like the Pyroclast Mapper or Pyroclast Miner in that it's very good at bossing, but it's even better at bossing, but it's even worse at mapping. So basically, this is the type of character you want to make if you're literally just doing bosses. He was hitting very high damage. He was cleaning these Ubers very quickly in terms of just single target. Once those poisons were rampant, it was doing damage out the window. The thing is, when you took this into a maps, you hated your life. So this is kind of like a boss-specific build. Outside of that, I did Stormbind Pathfinder. This is probably my second favorite build for me specifically. Stormbind's kind of growing on me. It's not very good at mapping. It isn't, but it's such a wacky, weird skill that it somehow grows on me, and I do just like the big burst of hand damage hits on enemies. I can recommend this if you want something that's decent at bossing and you don't mind a little bit of clunky mapping, but that's kind of up to you. Ultimately, this character would probably just be better with a Hierophant or Inquisitor angle. In terms of getting that AoE, I think the overlap damage would be better, and then just do Traitor to fix your flask management. That's probably how you play this character. I did Pathfinder to try something different to see how it would go. Okay, so moving on, Winter Orb Occultist, Curse Stacking. This is a great way to make use of Occultist, 1 for basically subtracting enemy cold res. You use Anathema, you're already using power charge stacking, you have basically unlimited good curses you can apply to a build. Most builds, they can only get 3, 4, maybe 5 curses. This build has about 6 curses that all are somewhat useful to the build in terms of taking advantage of those curses and getting large benefits from it. Enfeeble, Temp Change, Punishment, Frostbite, Ellie Weakness, and I think it was either Assassin's Mark or Projectile Weakness, I can't remember which. Point is, it utilizes all of those things to subtract the enemy's res to like negative 100 or negative 120, and then he puts on the mask of, I forget which, but it multiplies the enemy resistance by 1.5. So if you have them at negative 130, they go to negative like 200, basically, is how it works. So he utilized a lot of things to carry Winter Orb damage. Winter Orb is a skill that has a lot of like, what's the word? It has inbuilt good scaling. It's autonomous. You can move around while dealing damage. It has good AoE. It has the things, the building blocks to make a good skill are there. What it lacks is damage. So you have to give it a big crutch in damage support, which is what he was doing in terms of having double void batteries, the classic power charge stacking occultist, in order to scale that damage along with this new addition of the Anathema ring to then ramp that damage to the moon by getting the negative 200 res. That is what was needed to make Winter Orb actually deal some single target, and this character did quite a bit of single target. Unfortunately, this character also was very, very slow. It's a double wand. You can only flame dash. It had no movement speed. The sort of thing where you really need some investment to start getting the tailwind elusive boots, kind of like my character, where my character didn't have a lot of movement speed just because it didn't really have good movement speed on the boots, didn't have good movement speed on other gear pieces, stuff like that. Onslaught on kill, you really would need to ramp this character's movement speed to make it not feel bad while mapping, but it does have the base scaling is there to make a good build, in my opinion. SST Jug, this was just me wanting to try out a Jug with SST. Very strong, very good defensively. The main weakness this character had was to degen grounds. I lost to Cirrus, I lost to Exarch, classic degen ground boss fights, and the fights I had a little bit of trouble with were basically Shaper. I was intentionally testing what I could and couldn't tank. I did this a lot on Shapers, where Shaper is the easiest fight for me to do, but I want to get a feel for what my character can and cannot tank, because it gives me an idea of what to expect going on to the harder boss fights. So a lot of times you'll see I do Shaper for 5 deaths or a decent amount of deaths. I never lost to Shaper actually, but I died quite a bit on Shapers, mostly because I would test my character out, / I would be just warming up to playing the character, and normally this character, I don't think you'd ever die to Shaper if you're actually playing intelligently. Like for me, I was standing in degen ground, stuff like that. So solid character, a lot of armor scaling, Jug defenses, and then on top of that, you get a decent amount of damage scaling, and you get to chuck a shield around, which is something I can support. I like that shield build decent amount. And then build number 7 for Rutu, Spark Aura Stacker. He did this with a Pathfinder. I actually think this, he didn't, at the time when he played this build, he wasn't very happy with his result of going 5 out of 8 with it. He was kind of disappointed. Ultimately, I think that's just a matter of Spark heavily falls off when you get to arenas where Shaper, or no, not Shaper, Cirrus and Exarch, those arenas are so big. Until you have the high investment Spark, like basically gloves or additional Spark speed scaling and duration scaling, you're just not going to get extra hits, and Spark just falls off a cliff, right? That's just a couple boss fights. I wouldn't judge the character based on that personally, because that character had great defenses, had great movement speed, had great clear, and in any boss fight but the Cirrus and Exarch, it kind of dominated. He only lost to Cortex because he did a very bad Cortex. He did a Cortex with 150% more monster life or something like that. Very, very bad Cortex, and that in my opinion is the only reason he lost. He also kind of was misplaying a little bit. He was kind of throwing for content, I think, just a bit. I still think this character is actually pretty good. He was using res flasks to fix his res problems with melding. He was grabbing just a decent amount of max res on gear. It was a great basically way of solving a lot of problems Spark Aura Stacker has without putting much money to do it. And Pathfinder, I think, is actually a pretty good fit for it. I like the way the approach he took to this character quite a bit. So that's my opinion on Spark Aura Stacker. And then my Tri-Attribute Stacker, this is probably my favorite build I did out of all of them. I think this one has the best potential to be just an all-around, well-rounded beast, so to speak. But I think you have to do those changes of Determination for haste, You have to go to evasion, you have to drop some of those passes, re-put those passes somewhere else, get a bit more speed in the character, and I think it'll just feel good to play. Ultimately, you kind of need the armor scaling if you're just going to be doing Ubers, but since this was really a challenge about doing some Ubers on a low budget, that's why I felt like I should go for the armor and force it in. But I think this build could be well-rounded in a lot of other areas while having evasion plus spell suppress, high EHP, high regen, and still feel good while mapping perfectly fine in terms of defenses later. They had decent amount of defenses to begin with. So that is my opinion on most of the characters here. If I was going to rank them in terms of best builds, I would put the Exsanguinate Pathfinder. I would put this as my top build. I think Route 2 had the best character here with Exsanguinate Poison Pathfinder. If they nerf temp chains, that will probably heavily change. A lot of the builds Route 2 did were poison based. Poison is very, very strong now because of temp chains. So we'll see next league if they do any nerfs to curses and temp chains, because right now poison is just kind of S tier. So if curses change the same, Exsanguinate Pathfinder will be a great build going forward, I think. Also, after that, I think my second build, if I was ranking these builds, I think the second strongest build out of all these characters would be Spark Aura Stacker. I mean, you can look at the baseline scores of like, oh, it did 8 out of 8 Ubers, but I'm more or less thinking, what do I think would feel the best to play is an all-around a good build that I would recommend, and I think was good on the budget. And I would put Spark Aura Stacker next. I think after that, I would probably put my Tri-Attribute Cast on Crate Inquisitor if I was ranking them for things I would want to play and I would like and I think are strong, well-rounded builds. After that, I'd probably go for Cadogan's Impending Doom. If we're strictly going by power, ultimately, this build competition, I didn't end up winning. I think we lost by like 4 points or 3 points or something like that. I'm happy with how I did. I wasn't really trying to try hard or play for 8 out of 8. I was trying for, this is a reason I can make new interesting builds and try to see what we can do, type of thing. And I had a lot of fun with it. I'm really glad Rue challenged me to do this with him. I lost a lot of sleep over it. I'm going to be happy to move back to a normal sleep schedule where I'm not ending the stream at 5 a.m. But all in all, I think there's some good builds here. There's some good tech here. And if hopefully you enjoyed this content, I'll be interested in probably doing it in the future. Maybe not doing 7 days straight, maybe spacing it out a little bit more by like once every other day or once every other 3 days or once a week or something like that. This sort of challenge thing where I go hard for one play session to try to put a build together and make something new or make something that I think can work on a budget. I think it was a lot of fun. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this little series, and until next time, I think I'm going to go back to doing some of my more normal builds, which is just experimenting with weird stuff. I want to see maybe about doing a static strike character where I scale a bunch of energy shield and do ephemeral edge. I think that'll be fun. That's what I think what I'm going to do for my next project, but that'll be probably over a couple days, not just trying to force it all in one day and do a respec, stuff like that. So anyways, as always, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and take care, Exiles. Peace out.